Okay, in this video, we're going to wrap up chapter 2, and we're going to start by taking a look at some different exchange rate arrangements. The book lists 10 of them, 10 different kind of regimes that are going on right now in the world, has some different countries that are associated with those different regimes. I'm going to look at four, kind of focus on four here. So let's start with no separate legal tender. This is where you are using another country's currency. So, for instance, it might be a country that adopts the dollar. That's been done several times in the past to help prevent hyperinflation. Ecuador, not too long ago, adopted the US dollar to kind of help with some of their monetary issues. El Salvador has done it. Zimbabwe famously did it a number of years ago when they were running with inflation in the millions of a percent. They've recently, I think, gotten rid of the US dollar and gone back to their own currency. But it's been done historically, at least with the US dollar, to kind of impose some discipline on the national government where maybe there was hyperinflation. And again, if you're using someone else's currency, it has a set amount that you can't print a whole bunch of extra units of that currency. Other countries like Kosovo, Monaco, San Marino use the euro, even though they're not in the European Union. So they've adopted this currency that's in a region that's nearby geographically. And again, it's just a way that they've adopted this currency that kind of takes monetary policy decisions out of their hands. A second regime we want to look at is a currency board. This is where the currency for a particular country is tied to another country's currency at a set exchange rate. So, for instance, the Hong Kong dollar is tied to the US dollar, and over the past number of years, it's been set at $7.85 Hong Kong dollars, equal to $1. There's been a slight fluctuation in the value of the currency, and it's explicitly tied to the dollar. And so when the dollar is going up, the Hong Kong dollar will be going up as well. It'll be appreciating. So it's again tied to the currency of another place, and the currency board is kind of a group that manages that. It's a Hong Kong collective of basically like the central bank that's setting that peg and making sure it stays at a fixed exchange rate. Free floating is the third regime, and it's probably the most common, especially among large market economies around the world. So the euro is free floating, the US dollar is free floating, Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, UK all have free floating currencies. So by far and away, the vast majority of the value of currencies around the world are free floating. And then the last kind of group here, the last regime is the crawling peg or a crawl-like arrangement. So this is where the currency is adjusted by the central bank in small increments. There's more leeway for the crawl-like arrangement so that the exchange rate might be allowed to vary within bands. But it's a managed exchange rate, so there's the central bank and the government is kind of keeping an eye on it and making sure it's in at kind of a certain level or within a certain range, and they're intervening to keep it that way. So China is the kind of the preeminent example of a crawling peg, and the book mentions also countries like Ethiopia and Croatia. But China would be the prototypical example of the crawling peg. You should know that the euro, dollar, and these other countries have free floating. Hong Kong would be the kind of the typical example of the currency board, and then Ecuador, El Salvador, for the using another currency, another country's currency as your own, where you could also think about some of these countries near in Europe, not in the EU, but near these European countries that use the euro. So let's move on to this next part here and just have a brief look at the European Monetary Union and the euro. It's now the second most used currency in the world, so just a quick look at kind of the evolution of the European Union, how it came about. So the original countries using the euro currency were Austria, Belgium, Finland, France, etc. So those were kind of again the original countries as part of this monetary union. Others have since been added. So since 1999, others have begun to use it, including Greece, which is kind of maybe that's come back to haunt the EU, having Greece come in. Greece made some promises prior to joining the monetary union and kind of was a bad actor with those promises, didn't fulfill those promises, things like keeping their government deficit, the current account deficit, below certain levels, so they didn't follow through with these economic policy kind of changes and pledges that they made, and that's caused a number of problems since then. There's a number of countries waiting to get into the EU. There's still some conditions that they need to meet, so Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Sweden are all kind of in the queue. They aren't in there yet. Now, an important part here is that the monetary policy is conducted by the European Central Bank. There's no individual countries making their economic policy. This has to be done by the European Central Bank. They're kind of making currency decisions, policy decisions. They're setting rules for countries and what kind of deficits they can run. I think the magic number might be 3% of GDP is the limit. So you can't have a government deficit to kind of help fund or get your way out of a recession. So it's one of those things we talked about in chapter 1 where you've given up a little bit of sovereignty by joining this union. Some of the benefits of the union: there's reduced transaction costs and the elimination of exchange rate risk or uncertainty. There's better competition among members, so more price transparency. Now that's called a benefit. Some countries in the union might consider that a cost or a downside because they could compete by basically playing with their currencies in the past. Now you can't do that as a country, and you have to kind of compete on a level playing field. And then another big part is that the European Union is a very large capital market. In terms of depth, it's the second most used currency, as I mentioned, but the European Union is going to have hundreds of millions of people, maybe at or above the size of the U.S. in terms of the number of people, and also a very large market where by being in the Union, you can freely exchange goods, services, people can move across borders, labor is can move as well. It's mobile, so those are the benefits. The costs of the Union, again, are the loss of national policy independence. You aren't sovereign in many senses anymore. You have to kind of follow what the European Central Bank decides. You can't deal with asymmetric shocks. So these are shocks that kind of impact or have differential impacts on countries. So maybe there's something that hurts Italy much more than it does France. And by being part of this union, you can't really make adjustments, tweaks as the Italian national government with your monetary policy to deal with these asymmetric shocks. You just kind of have to suck it up and deal with it. So those asymmetric shocks aren't dealt with at the euro level. Other things would have to happen to kind of deal with those. So those are the downsides of the union, probably in the aggregate. Well, it's kind of a lingering question, right? There's countries, France has there's been people in France talking about the Frexit, French exit from the European Union. There's probably a Grexit where you got Greece thinking about leaving or threatening to leave. You got Brexit. So it's not apparent right now that this has been a uniformly successful venture. Maybe more good than bad, but there's still some disruptions and some downsides to this union. And then the last thing are the currency crises that were kind of listed out and discussed in the chapter. I'm going to leave this to you as something for you to explore if you're interested in it. I'm not going to ask any explicit questions on any of these three areas. We'll kind of free up more time for other discussions later on in the course, but for now, we're going to ignore currency crises. And so I'll, again, leave it to you. If you're interested, you can dig in more into that area. And with that, we are done with Chapter 2, and I'll pick up in a future video with Chapter 3.